Welcome to another episode of Series C Growthonomics. Today we will continue our conversation on experimentation. Last time we talked about what not to do in experiments, how experiments fail. This time, today, we have Sarvan with me and we're going to talk about how to do experimentation. So over to you, Sarvan.
Thank you so much, Priyanka, for having me here and giving me the opportunity to talk about my experience with experimentation. Today, we'll be talking about a dating app and improving the user experience on it. We're going to consider a case wherein a free user on the app is shown 5 suggestions a day. And if the user wants to see more suggestions, they have to upgrade to a paid plan. So the product manager working on this app has a really brilliant idea of using the Spotify favorites as a set of features to improve the likelihood of users being suggested matching with each other. Because, of course, who doesn't like music, right? And if you like the same kind of music, perhaps you'll be into each other as well. So let's consider a case wherein the product manager launches an experiment to identify how the incorporation of the Spotify favorites list as a feature set in the matching algorithm improves the match rate, which the product manager determines is the success metric. Because better the match rate, the happier the users are. And so the product manager launches the experiment with the 50-50 random split. And using the tool that he uses to manage the experiment, he stops it once the result shows statistical significance. And it is observed that the match rate went up and the experiment is deemed a win. So the product manager goes ahead with the feature launch and he's really happy about it. But 2 months later, problems are observed with the business, and the specifics of it are that churn has gone up. Fewer users are using the app compared to what the situation was earlier.
Why do you believe the churn rate went up?
So even though the incorporation of the Spotify songs list improved the match rate because users could see what music their suggestions were into, this also resulted in the flip side of fewer matches being shown or fewer suggestions being shown to each user because now the algorithm only showed users who matched on all other aspects as well as the Spotify music list. So there were cases wherein essentially the users who matched on other aspects did not match on Spotify because they did not connect their Spotify account to the dating app. They did not have enough music on there, or the songs on the users list did not match with anyone else on the app that they were interested in.
Makes sense. So now with proper planning, what would you do differently?
Right. So let's talk about how this experiment can be conducted in a planned fashion instead. So in this hypothetical situation, we will consider the discussion amongst the team members within the squad, wherein the product manager comes up with the same brilliant idea, but there is a discussion around how the change is going to affect user behavior. And so the possibility of users being shown fewer suggestions is discussed upfront and identified as a risk. This leads to a change in the way the experiment is carried out, in that if a user does not get 5 suggestions a day based on the new algorithm, the old algorithm is used to fulfill the shortfall. So for example, if a user is shown only 3 suggestions on a given day from the new algorithm, which includes the Spotify playlist, 2 further suggestions are added to that user's list based on the old algorithm, which does not incorporate the songs list. So this particular experiment is launched in after careful planning and deliberation. And the analyst within the team is able to help the product manager minimize the risk associated with the experiment. Proper sample size calculation is carried out so that the smallest of changes with match rate can be observed with the smallest sample size possible. And once the experiment is launched with a 95-5 split instead of a 50-50 as we observed in the case earlier, it was observed that the match rate did go up, but the contingency plan in the algorithm ensured that the number of suggestions did not go down, and therefore churn did not go up, as was the situation in the first case. So
That's
the
great. So
experiment,
what
experiment was deemed a success, and the product was launched, which resulted 2 months down the line in the NPS going up and ratings on the App Store and Play Store going up as well.
That's great. That's great. What would you say was that impact calculation done?
Right. So once the results of the experiment were tallied in terms of the increase in the match rate, this was compared with the revenue generated from the control group over a historical period, and the increased match rate was taken into account, and the future revenue predictions were rolled out over a 1 year period for the given set of users active on the app. And it was identified that the change would result in $10 million of increased revenue per annum with an error of about $1.5 million on either side. So between 8.5 to $11.5 million of increased
Great.
revenue.
So what would you say are the key takeaways? Obviously, we are not going into the full detail of every step in the experimentation, but what are the key things you would want the audience to take away?
Right. So to carry out experiments in a successful fashion, I think there are 4 or 5 points which should be incorporated into the process. The first is risk assessment. As we observed in the first case, adverse effects of changes being made to the app were not identified, and this led to increase in the churn. Right. So the question is, how do changes made to a certain part of the app, a certain part of the business, affect other parts of the business? Do they result in adverse effects which can be identified early on so as to mitigate them? The second step in successful experimentation is the identification of an apt success metric. We saw in this case that the success metric used was the match rate, but in the second scenario wherein proper planning was done, it was ensured that a secondary success metric of the number of suggestions shown to the users was also kept in mind while planning the experiment. This led to mitigation of adverse effects and better control on the predicted outcome of the experiment. In situations where 2 success metrics are identified, wherein one can go up and the other can go down, if possible, it is prudent to combine the 2 success metrics into one and use the single metric. In cases where this is not possible, both the metrics should be observed to ensure that the net effect of the experiment is positive. The third step to successful experimentation is the sample size calculation, and this involves 3 aspects. The first is type 1 error, the second is type 2 error, and the third is the effect size. Type 1 error tells you what is the likelihood that the feature, if rolled out, will be successful, given that the experiment says it is successful. Type 2 error accounts for when the experiment says it is not successful, but in fact, it would have been successful if launched. And the effect size is essentially the smallest possible difference that we want to account for in the results of the experiment. And in cases where we have 2 success metrics, as discussed, we want to ensure that the effect size is taken into account such that the smallest difference between the 2 success metrics can be observed. The fourth point is mutually exclusive experimentation, wherein particularly within startups, we observe that multiple experiments are being carried out by different teams at the same time. This results in users being exposed to multiple experiments at a time and leads to adverse impact on the observed metrics. The final step, which is in fact also the first step, is the quantification of the metrics. Prior to launch of the experiment, quantification of the revenue or profit impacts on the company are estimated based on rough estimates of the change in the success metric. Once the experiment's results are tallied, a much narrower and more confident interval of revenue or profit impact can be calculated. And this leads to the question whether the profit is in fact existent or it is potentially loss making. And even if it is profitable endeavor, whether the profits are worth pursuing.
That's great. So we shared today 5 key takeaways for our audience. We talked about risk assessment, assess your risk, think clearly about success metrics, maximum 2, specifically if you can't combine them. Sample size calculation, obviously it's pretty complex to do sample size calculation. A lot goes into it, but the 3 aspects you talked about was type 1, type 2 error, as well as effect size. And you also talked about making sure we have clean random sample, mutually exclusive, which is often doable using within the tool itself that you're launching with. And lastly, making sure that the impact calculation is done. So with that, we welcome any comments you have and conversation you have on how to do experimentation. We haven't obviously covered the full detail of how to do experimentation, but these are the key aspects that you should take into account, and these are the top places where things can go wrong. Next time, we're going to talk about behavioral economics and how it plays into experimentation. Often the way how you expect the subscriber to behave or the customer to behave is not how they actually end up behaving. So that's something to wait for from the next time, and I will see you next time.